They laughed when she spoke, but the numbers never lied. Margaret Hayes was 28, a quiet secretary at a billion-dollar company, known more for her coffee than her voice. One morning, she saw something in a contract, a hidden risk, a number that didn't feel right. She spoke up in a room full of powerful men. The CEO laughed, and so did everyone else. What would you do? If your voice was ignored, your judgment dismissed, your intelligence questioned, not because you were wrong, but because you weren't seen, would you walk away, or would you keep believing not in them, but in yourself? This is the story of a woman who chose the quiet path of truth over pride, who didn't shout, didn't storm out, but who changed an entire company, one spreadsheet at a time. Her journey began in silence, but it ended with the whole room listening. If this story touches something in you, your past, your journey, or your dreams, please consider liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters too. And now, let me tell you what happened on the day everything began to change. She had done the math. She knew the numbers didn't add up. But when she spoke, the Millionaire CEO laughed and the room followed. It was just after 9 on a Thursday morning, and the boardroom on the 24th floor of Sterling Appliances was already tense. The meeting had been called to finalize a multi-million-dollar contract with a new overseas supplier, Caraway International. The buzz in the building had been growing for weeks. This was the deal that would catapult Sterling into a new supply chain era. Faster ports, leaner operations, higher returns. Everyone in the room could feel it, the anticipation of progress, of promotion, of power. Everyone but Margaret Hayes. She sat near the end of the long walnut table, a legal pad resting on her lap, pen in hand, posture straight but quiet as always. At 28, she had been working at Sterling for 3 years, most of that time as the personal secretary to Daniel Lockhart, the company's magnetic and sharp-edged CEO. She had no Ivy League degree, no MBA, no executive title, but she had eyes and ears and the kind of brain that didn't sleep when numbers didn't sit right. Margaret had stayed late 3 nights in a row, not because anyone asked her to. No one noticed if she left late. No one noticed much about her at all, but something in the draft contract bothered her, a string of cost projections that seemed too optimistic, too clean. She'd seen enough shipping reports and customs ledgers over the past few years to recognize when something looked too good to be true. So, she'd done the math. Twice. And now, as the meeting moved toward its inevitable conclusion, a unanimous green light for the deal, her heart began to pound harder. Not with panic, but with a quiet insistence. You have to say something, even if it's just a question. Daniel Lockhart leaned forward, his hand resting confidently on the table. Caraway's proposal outpaces our current supply chain by nearly 20% in delivery time. That means higher throughput, less downtime, and most importantly, higher customer satisfaction. This is exactly the kind of partnership that positions us for scale. There were murmurs of agreement. A few executives glanced at each other, already calculating projections in their heads. Margaret cleared her throat softly. At first, no one heard. She tried again. "Excuse me, Mr. Lockhart." The voices paused. Heads turned. She rarely spoke during board meetings, unless asked to schedule something or retrieve coffee. Daniel looked at her, surprised. Not hostile, just curious. "Yes, Margaret." She held her voice steady. "I was reviewing the freight estimates for the Caraway deal. I noticed that the shipping costs listed for the mid-Atlantic ports are roughly 17% higher than the current market average for that route. That discrepancy might affect our overall margin if not adjusted." There was a beat of silence. Then Daniel chuckled, a warm, confident sound meant to diffuse, not demean, but it still carried weight. "Margaret," he said with a smile, "I appreciate your diligence, but global logistics isn't exactly your lane." A few soft chuckles followed. One executive smirked behind his hand. Another shook his head slightly, as if amused by a well-meaning child interrupting grown-up talk. Daniel continued, "Our procurement team, all Harvard-trained by the way, has vetted this top to bottom. I'm confident they didn't miss a decimal." He turned back to the room, clearly ready to move on, but Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't fumble. She simply nodded once, tucked her pen back into the spiral of her notebook, and quietly said, "Understood." Then she stood. The room didn't notice at first. Daniel was already back to summarizing closing terms. But Margaret's departure was deliberate, not dramatic, just firm. She stepped out of the boardroom and walked down the quiet hallway, the sound of her low heels echoing against the polished tile. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She didn't crumble. Not this time. Back at her desk, the office felt unchanged, the same hum of printers, phones, and fluorescent lights. But something inside her had shifted. She placed the notebook down gently, reached for her keyboard, began typing the meeting notes. Her face was calm, but her eyes, they were no longer quiet. Behind them, a fire had started to build, not a fire of anger, but of certainty, of conviction. Daniel had laughed, and the room had followed. But Margaret knew what she saw. And something told her deep down in the same part of her that never got credit but always paid attention. This wasn't over. To them, she was just a secretary. But Margaret had been studying numbers long before any of them knew her name. Long before the walnut boardroom and custom suits. Long before Daniel Lockhart ever raised an eyebrow at her quiet voice. Margaret Hayes had been watching numbers the way other children watched clouds, trying to understand their shapes, their patterns, their moods. She was born and raised in a modest neighborhood outside Bloomington, Indiana. Her mother, Annette, ran a small repair shop from their garage, fixing broken toasters, microwaves, lawnmowers. Margaret spent her childhood afternoons crouched beside a folding table, handing her mother tools while trying to decipher the logic behind tangled wires and half-burnt circuits. It wasn't glamorous, but it was precise, predictable. There was comfort in that. By middle school, she was balancing the shop's modest ledger in a spiral notebook. By high school, she'd built her own spreadsheet to help her mom track seasonal patterns in repair demand, which months were slow, which appliances failed most after storms, how to manage orders with limited cash flow. Her mother never finished college, but she was wise in her own way. Numbers don't lie. "Maggie," she used to say, wiping grease from her hands. People do. Paperwork sometimes does. But numbers. If you learn to listen, they'll always tell you when something's wrong. So, Margaret listened. She earned a partial scholarship to a small college, in-state, not the kind of place headhunters watched, but good enough to learn the fundamentals. She chose finance, not because she dreamed of Wall Street, but because she believed in what her mother taught her, that numbers were stories, and someone needed to tell the truth. But after graduation, the offers didn't come. She applied to over 50 companies. Most didn't reply. A few sent rejection letters thanking her for her interest, and some invited her to interviews that felt like exercises in futility. She knew her resume didn't sparkle. No internships at big firms, no network. Eventually, a friend from church mentioned a job opening at Sterling Appliances. The role wasn't in finance. It wasn't even in accounting. It was a secretarial position. Steady hours, good benefits, a decent paycheck. Margaret didn't flinch. She took the job with quiet gratitude, packed up her modest apartment, and moved closer to the office. But she never stopped listening to the numbers. Her desk sat outside the executive offices, near enough to hear strategy meetings behind thin doors. She filed contracts, scheduled travel, fetched coffee, and made copies, all the while collecting documents in her mind. Whenever a report passed her desk, she glanced at the totals. Whenever someone left their slides open on the screen, she memorized the graphs. Each evening, she took quiet notes just for herself, just to learn. She didn't need permission to grow. She just needed time, and in the quiet hours after 6 p.m., when the hallways emptied and voices faded, Margaret stayed behind with her thermos of peppermint tea and dug deeper. It wasn't ambition that kept her there, not pride either. It was instinct, a pull, like something inside her whispered, "Keep watching. One day, this will matter." That one day had begun 3 weeks earlier. When the first draft of the Caraway International proposal passed through her inbox, she noticed a figure that didn't sit right, a shipping estimate. The kind of detail no one double-checked, too small to matter, too big to ignore. She didn't speak up then. She made a note. The second version came with adjusted timelines tighter than what she'd seen from similar suppliers. Again, she made a note. Then came the executive summary. It was glossy, confident, but the logic beneath the marketing shimmered with inconsistency. That night, she skipped dinner, stayed past 9, pulled out a clean spreadsheet, and began building a model side-by-side comparisons of freight costs, seasonal variations, return rate trends. One tab became 5, then 10. The deeper she looked, the more unease crawled up her spine. It wasn't just one off number, it was a pattern. Inflated port fees, loopholes in the return policies, and the contractual clause on logistics adjustment thresholds, a term vague enough to bury $1 million loss in plain sight. No one had asked her to do this, and no one would thank her for it. But she couldn't unknow what she knew. So, on a quiet Wednesday evening, the night after the infamous boardroom laugh, she sat at her desk long after the lights on the floor had dimmed. The printer buzzed beside her, spitting out 40 pages data, side notes, highlighted terms. She punched 3 holes in the stack, slid them into a plain black binder, opened a fresh Word document. At the top of the page, she typed "Red Flags, contract number 441, prepared by M. Hayes." She paused, then deleted her name. She wasn't ready to be known, not yet. As she saved the file and reached to turn off her lamp, a thought settled into her mind, steady and unshakable. If no one else would see it, she would find a way to make them. She knew they wouldn't listen, but she couldn't stay silent. By the next morning, Margaret had reviewed the binder 3 times. It wasn't fancy. No flashy charts, no business school jargon, just clean formatting, clear comparisons, and quiet truths, the kind of truths most people overlook because they don't scream. Each section walked the reader through the discrepancies with calm logic, inflated shipping costs compared to regional averages, opaque return clauses buried in the fine print, a suspicious adjustment term that could bleed cash without triggering review. She had even color-coded the key risks, red for urgent, yellow for unclear, green for safe zones. Anyone reading it wouldn't need a finance degree to understand the danger. They'd only need to care. And she wasn't sure anyone would. Still, before the office filled up that Thursday morning, Margaret stood in front of the big copy machine in the legal department, a manila envelope in hand. She fed it 2 copies of her report, one for Daniel Lockhart's office, the other for Sterling's internal legal team. She didn't sign her name, no handwritten notes. No, you might want to look at this. Just the envelope sealed shut with "confidential" typed on the label. By 8:15 a.m., they were both in the inner office mail bin. She returned to her desk, opened her inbox, and began responding to calendar requests. She didn't feel brave. She didn't feel heroic. She just felt finished. Whatever happened next, she could sleep knowing she hadn't looked away. Across the building, Daniel Lockhart leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. His morning espresso sat untouched on his desk. Something about the Caraway deal was starting to gnaw at him, a quiet discomfort he hadn't felt in a long time. He had built his career on confidence, speed, and bold moves. Second-guessing wasn't his style. But now, with the signing date just 2 days away, a knot had formed at the base of his chest. It had started the moment Margaret spoke in the boardroom. She had barely said 5 sentences, yet, somehow, they echoed louder than any executive pitch. He told himself it was nothing. A logistics detail, a misunderstanding. Still, the look in her eyes steady, unafraid, stayed with him. That evening, after most employees had gone home, Daniel stood at the glass wall of his corner office, watching headlights snake down the interstate. He hated doubt, but something told him he'd been too quick to dismiss it. Friday morning, 9:02 a.m., the legal team's director, Janice Keller, walked into Daniel's office with a folder in hand. She didn't sit. "We received this anonymously," she said, placing the envelope on his desk. No signature, no trail, but whoever sent it did their homework. Daniel raised an eyebrow and opened the report. It was clean, thorough, surprisingly easy to follow. He flipped page after page, and each line tightened the knot in his chest. The numbers matched some of what his team had skimmed. But this version, this anonymous report, exposed details no one else had caught. Worse yet, it explained how Sterling might be walking into a massive liability. "Did your team confirm any of this?" Daniel asked quietly. "We cross-checked some of the supplier agreements this morning," Janice said. "And yes, some of these red flags match our internal concerns. We just hadn't compiled them this clearly." Daniel set the folder down and stared at it. He didn't know who wrote it, but someone inside this building had seen what others missed. Someone had cared enough to risk being ignored, or, worse, ridiculed. At 10:15 a.m., Margaret was typing up a memo on Q3 holiday scheduling when her office phone rang. "Mr. Lockhart would like to see you," Patricia said. Margaret's hands paused. She glanced toward the CEO's hallway, heart flickering, but her voice was calm. "On my way." Daniel didn't mention the envelope. Not yet. He asked her to confirm the schedule for that afternoon's procurement meeting, then stood and walked around his desk. "You've been working here how long now?" "Margaret," he asked, arms loosely folded. 3 years, sir," she replied. He nodded, as if mentally recalibrating something. Then he turned to the large window again. "Let's push the Caraway signing," he said suddenly. Margaret blinked. "Sir, I want the procurement team to reevaluate the full contract, with legal present, and I want the financial models rebuilt this time, without assumptions." He turned back to her. "And Margaret, please order lunch for the review team. It might be a long session." She gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." She turned to leave quietly, as always. But Daniel called after her. "And Margaret." She paused. His voice softened. "Thank you for always paying attention." Her hand tightened around the folder in her arms, though her face didn't change. "You're welcome, sir." That evening, long after most had gone home, Daniel sat alone in the boardroom. The anonymous report lay open before him. He read it again, slower this time, line by line. No flair, no self-congratulation, just facts, warnings, honesty, the kind of work that didn't seek credit, only clarity. And somehow, it felt familiar. Daniel picked up the report, turned it over, and stared at the blank back cover. Whoever had written this had just changed everything, and he intended to find out who they were, for the first time in a long time. Daniel Lockhart doubted his own judgment. It wasn't just the numbers. It was the way they had been laid out, clear, structured, deliberate. Whoever had written the anonymous report hadn't just reviewed the contract. They had understood it, cared about it. That level of clarity couldn't come from guesswork. Daniel stayed in his office long after the last light in the building flickered out. He poured himself a second cup of coffee, black, lukewarm, and opened the report again. This time, he wasn't reading like a CEO. He was reading like a student who had missed something vital and knew it. And he had. Every note in the report was precise. The projected freight costs, broken down by port and quarter, the risk analysis, using past data from similar deals, the fine print language that even his legal team had overlooked. Daniel rubbed his temples and exhaled through his nose. He wasn't angry. He was something worse. Humbled. By midnight, he was combing through his inbox, searching, scrolling, scanning. Something about the writing style in the report tugged at a memory. The formatting, the phrasing, even the spacing between headers, it was familiar in a quiet way. That's when he thought of Margaret. He almost dismissed the idea, but the moment he reopened one of her old meeting summaries, the truth began to whisper louder, the same quiet precision, the same way of letting facts speak for themselves, no embellishment, no ego. He clicked through 3 more memos she had written over the past year, reports he had barely skimmed at the time. And there it was, nestled in a weekly summary from 3 weeks ago. Note: preliminary review of the Caraway proposal indicates a possible discrepancy in freight estimates for mid-Atlantic ports, recommending secondary review before final commitment. He hadn't read that line before. Or maybe he had and dismissed it, just as he had dismissed her voice in the boardroom. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling very tired. How many times had she spoken through paper, through silence, through thoughtful work that no one ever credited? How many times had he assumed that the smartest people in the room were the ones already sitting at the table by morning? Daniel had made a decision. He called Patricia, his assistant, and said 5 words she had never heard from him in 3 years. Please schedule Margaret Hayes, privately. There was a pause. For what meeting? Sir, no meeting, he said. Just me and her. And tell her. He hesitated. Tell her it's about her report. At 2:00 p.m. sharp. Margaret stood outside the CEO's office, clutching her notepad as she had 100 times before. But this time, the air felt different. Not tense, not cold, just waiting. Patricia gave her a curt nod, then opened the door. Daniel stood as Margaret entered. No tie today, just a simple gray shirt with rolled sleeves. He motioned toward the chair across from his desk. Close the door. Please. She did. Then, for the first time since joining the company, Margaret Hayes sat in the CEO's office, not as a secretary taking notes, but as someone who might have something to say worth hearing. Daniel didn't speak right away. He studied her face, the same face he'd passed in the hallway dozens of times without really seeing. She looked calm, not proud, not defensive, just composed. I owe you an apology, he said finally. Margaret blinked, surprised. Sir, I read the report 3 times. She said nothing. I know you sent it anonymously, he continued. And I understand why. You had every reason to believe it would be ignored, or worse. She didn't confirm or deny it. Her silence spoke volumes. Daniel exhaled, then leaned forward. What I want to know is, how long have you been doing this kind of analysis? Margaret looked down for a moment, then back at him. Since the first Caraway draft came through, she said quietly. But really, longer. Daniel nodded slowly, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the black binder, the original printout of her report. He placed it between them. "This is the best risk assessment I've seen in 5 years," he said. "Then, with deliberate calm, I'd like to hear your thoughts, not as my assistant, but as a professional." Margaret sat a little straighter, her hands still in her lap. For the first time since she started at Sterling, she felt something shift, not in the room, but inside her. She wasn't invisible anymore. He once laughed at her. Now he listened like his company depended on her, because it did. The boardroom was quieter than usual, not silent in the uncomfortable way it had been the last time Margaret had spoken, but still, as if something important was about to unfold. This time, only Daniel was there. No line of executives, no smirks, no folded arms waiting for her to trip. Just the CEO, a legal pad in front of him, pen ready. Margaret took a breath, then another. And she began. She didn't start with the numbers. She started with the structure, how contracts like this were supposed to work. The logic behind pricing tiers, freight margins, seasonal variations in supplier delivery windows. Her voice was steady, even soft at times, but the clarity in her tone cut through like glass. Then she moved to the discrepancies. She walked Daniel through the red flags, one by one, cross-referencing pages from the vendor's proposal with independent market data. She pointed out the inflated port fees in Charleston, the vague adjustment clauses tucked into page 17, the projected savings that were only possible if the supplier's historical data, which had not been provided, somehow defied every known logistics trend from the last 5 years. Daniel didn't interrupt once. He wrote. He nodded. He asked 2 questions. She answered both, not with hesitation, but with calm certainty. She didn't posture. She didn't condescend. And she didn't mention her degree. Didn't bring up the scholarship she had earned. Didn't flash her honors, or her GPA, or the offers she had once turned down to take a job behind a desk that no one ever looked behind. All she brought into the room was truth, and it was more than enough. Halfway through her presentation, Margaret opened a separate folder. "This is a list of 3 alternative suppliers," she said. "2 are domestic, 1 international. I've done preliminary vetting. Their pricing is slightly higher, but they're fully transparent on freight and returns." Daniel raised his eyes. "You vetted other vendors I started last week," she said, "just in case my concerns were correct. I didn't want to come to you with only problems." Daniel blinked, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When Margaret finished, she closed her binder and folded her hands. She didn't smile. She didn't fidget. She just waited. Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling in. He looked down at his notes, then back up at the woman in front of him, the same woman he had once dismissed with a laugh. His voice, when it came, was low. "I was wrong to laugh," he said. "I was wrong. About you." Margaret stayed quiet. "And this company," he continued, "owes you everything." The next morning, Daniel called an unscheduled leadership huddle. Only 7 people were in the room: department heads, 1 attorney, and Margaret. There were no nameplates, no introductions. Daniel opened the meeting by explaining the Caraway deal had been suspended pending full internal review. Then he did something no one expected. He turned to Margaret and said, simply, "Please walk them through what you found." She did, and not one person interrupted her. That afternoon, Daniel sent an internal memo, short, clear, and unlike anything his staff had seen before, effective immediately. Margaret Hayes will join the Strategic Analysis Group as a contributing analyst for contract risk assessment. Her insight has spared Sterling Appliances from significant loss and highlighted the need for better internal accountability. Please welcome her accordingly. No secretary in company history had ever crossed that line. But Margaret did without asking, without demanding. Simply by doing what no one else had done, she paid attention. And she cared. As Margaret gathered her things from her old desk that evening, a few employees stopped by, curious, congratulatory, some even sheepish. She smiled, thanked them softly, and packed the last of her notepads. When she walked into the glass-walled office of the Strategic Analysis Group, the city lights caught her reflection. And for the first time, she saw what Daniel Lockhart had finally seen. Not the woman behind the desk, but the one who had quietly saved them all. Respect doesn't always come quickly, but when it arrives, it changes everything. At first, the room didn't shift. When Margaret took her seat at the long walnut table in the Strategic Analysis Group's conference room, most of the other analysts barely looked up. A few offered polite nods. One or two didn't bother. No one said it aloud, but the doubt was thick in the air. She was the secretary, the girl who used to refill the coffee pot, take lunch orders, coordinate flight changes. Now she had a seat at their table. Some smiled kindly, but with that certain softness that said, "We'll see how long she lasts." And Margaret. She noticed everything, but she didn't respond with defensiveness or overcompensation. She didn't try to prove them wrong in a single dazzling presentation. Instead, she did what she always had. She listened, she observed, and when she spoke, she made it count. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's presence became more than a novelty. Her reports were clean, her questions cut to the bone of every proposal. She never tried to take credit, never interrupted, never made things personal. But one by one, the other analysts began to realize something. She saw things they didn't. In a meeting about a high-stakes vendor partnership with a European supplier, the team hit a wall. The logistics looked solid. The legal contracts were airtight. But something felt off, something no one could quite name. Margaret sat quietly, flipping through the vendor's financial appendix. Then she leaned forward. Has anyone verified their currency hedge strategies? The euro's forecast volatility next quarter could wipe out the projected margins if they're exposed. The room went still. One of the senior analysts blinked. That wasn't included in the proposal. It wasn't, Margaret said gently. But it should have been. 2 hours later, her hunch was confirmed. The supplier had no plan to offset currency shifts, which would have cost Sterling over $6 million in a single quarter. After that, people started looking when she walked into the room. Daniel Lockhart noticed the shift too. He no longer led meetings with the same commanding voice as before. He asked more questions, spoke less. And when Margaret raised her hand, he always paused just a second longer than he did for anyone else. At first, that raised eyebrows. But then, one by one, others followed his lead. On a quiet Wednesday evening, Margaret stayed late in the office. She didn't mind. The work gave her focus, and the hum of the city outside felt more like company than noise. Daniel passed by the glass wall, saw the glow of her screen, and paused. Still here, she looked up and smiled. Final review on the Southport acquisition files. He hesitated, then stepped in. Mind if I join you? They reviewed the spreadsheets together, side by side, long after the sun dipped behind the skyline. It became a quiet rhythm a few evenings a week. No small talk, just work, shared focus, and the gentle understanding between two people who had both learned something the hard way. On the first Monday of the new quarter, the entire company received an internal email from the CEO's office. Subject gratitude, where it's due this month. Our company narrowly avoided a multi-million-dollar loss due to early risk detection in the Southport Acquisition Review. That foresight came from Margaret Hayes. Her expertise, diligence, and commitment to excellence represent exactly the standard we aim for across every team. Please join me in recognizing her contributions, not just to one deal, but to the culture of vigilance and courage she's helping shape. It was the first time many employees outside the executive floor had heard her name, and they didn't forget it. In the cafeteria, someone called her the woman who saved Southport. Downstairs, a junior accountant pinned her email signature to his cubicle wall, scribbled with a note, "Pay attention like Margaret does." That evening, as the office dimmed once more, Margaret sat in the same conference room where it all began. Daniel entered quietly, 2 coffees in hand, one for her, one for him. As they reviewed the next week's merger files together, their hands brushed slightly over a page. Neither of them pulled away, and neither of them said a word. But something had changed. And it wasn't just the room anymore. Somewhere between spreadsheets and strategy sessions, something unspoken began to grow. It wasn't sudden. There was no dramatic pause, no long stare across a crowded office. It was quieter than that. It was the way Daniel started bringing 2 cups of coffee instead of 1 without asking how she took it, but somehow getting it right. It was the way Margaret began saving a chair beside her in every meeting, even though she never wrote his name on it. And it was the first time he laughed, really laughed at something she said, not because he had to, but because her dry wit caught him off guard in the middle of a long afternoon reviewing vendor disclosures. "Remind me to hire you as our official sarcasm consultant," he'd said, smiling without effort. "You couldn't afford me," she replied, eyes twinkling. They didn't linger on moments like that. They moved past them, gracefully, professionally, but they remembered. In the weeks that followed, the work never slowed. Deals piled up, timelines tightened, but amidst it all, Margaret and Daniel began to share fragments of themselves, just enough to feel real. She told him about growing up in Indiana, how her mother ran a small sewing shop from their porch, rain or shine, how every extra dollar went toward Margaret's community college tuition, how she'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher before the numbers started whispering to her. He told her about his father, a man who built the Sterling brand from nothing but blue-collar grit and the refusal to fail, how Daniel had inherited not just the company, but the weight of a legacy. How, some nights, he didn't know where the business ended and he began. They never went too deep, but they never stayed entirely at the surface either. Then came the week Margaret didn't show up. No warning, no calls, just absence. At first, Daniel assumed she was working remotely. But when her desk stayed empty for 3 straight days, concern crept in. He asked Patricia, his assistant, quietly, "Family emergency." She replied, "Her mother's ill." She went back home. Daniel nodded, trying not to let it show on his face. But the next day, when he walked into a meeting room without her, it felt colder. The charts looked incomplete. The conversations lacked their usual rhythm. Even the coffee didn't taste quite right. That evening, he sat in his office alone. The city outside glowed, indifferent. He stared at a half-written report, unable to focus. Then, on impulse, he picked up his phone. He typed quickly, then hesitated. Backspace, retype, backspace again. Finally, he hit send. "The office misses you. I miss your voice of reason." No emoji, no signature, just a sentence that somehow said more than it should. It took hours for her to reply. When she did, it was simple. "Mom's stable. I'll be back Monday. Thank you for the message." That was it. But Daniel read it 3 times and smiled. Margaret returned the following week. There were no grand reunions, No dramatic glances. But Daniel noticed the soft exhaustion behind her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted slightly more than usual. He didn't ask for details. He just slid a fresh cup of coffee across her desk at 7:45 and said, "Glad you're here." She smiled, not politely, not out of habit, but like someone who had been seen, not just noticed. They returned to their routine, but something had shifted. The pauses between their conversations grew warmer. The silence between them felt less like distance and more like comfort. One evening, after a particularly tense negotiation, they found themselves back in the quiet corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows. The rest of the building was empty. They were supposed to be reviewing risk disclosures, but neither reached for the documents. Instead, they talked about nothing and everything. Margaret mentioned a book she was reading, a memoir by a woman who had lost everything and still found joy in small things. Daniel said he admired that, said he was trying to remember what joy looked like outside of quarterly gains. At one point, their hands brushed across the table. They didn't pull away, not right away. And when their eyes met, just for a moment, the air between them held something still, something quiet, something neither of them named, but both of them felt. That night, back in her apartment, Margaret sat by the window with a cup of tea. She thought about how much had changed, how the man who had once humiliated her in a room full of executives now looked at her like she was the person he trusted most. She wrapped her hands tighter around the mug. What was she feeling? Admiration, gratitude, respect, or something deeper, something harder to admit and more frightening to feel? The next evening, they met again for another late session. And this time, when their eyes met across the table, they lingered just a second longer than they had any right to. Whatever it was no longer unspoken, just quietly unfolding. It was supposed to be a thank you dinner, but it became something far more intimate. The invitation came on a Friday afternoon. Daniel stopped by Margaret's desk, a lightness in his tone that she hadn't heard before. "We wrapped the Hammond deal ahead of schedule," he said, placing a small envelope in front of her. "That wouldn't have happened without you." She looked up, brows slightly raised. "You know I don't need thanks." "I know," he said, smiling, "but I want to offer it anyway." "Dinner." "Just us. Tomorrow night." He said it casually. No pressure, no subtext. But when he walked away, Margaret stared at the envelope a long time before opening it. Inside was a simple card, handwritten, "Saturday, 7 p.m. La Brielle. Tables under my name. Dress however you'd dress to celebrate something you're proud of." Her fingers brushed over the ink. Somehow, that last line meant more than anything else. La Brielle was the kind of place that didn't need a sign to be recognized. Warm lights, white tablecloths, a pianist in the corner, playing something soft and nostalgic. Margaret arrived right on time. Her dress was navy blue, simple, elegant, with sleeves that just brushed her elbows. The kind of thing her mother would have called understated grace. Daniel stood when he saw her, and for a moment all his corporate armor slipped away. "You look," he began, then smiled, exactly like someone who knows her worth. She laughed, and the evening began. They didn't talk about work, not once. Instead, they spoke of small, human things. The book Margaret had been reading, a quiet novel about aging and memory and love that arrives late but lingers long. Daniel admitted he hadn't finished a book in 2 years, but remembered reading To Kill a Mockingbird in high school and crying when Atticus lost the trial. They talked about childhood dreams. Margaret once wanted to be a librarian. She used to stack her stuffed animals into rows and read to them on stormy afternoons. Daniel confessed he once dreamed of opening a jazz bar in Chicago. Just a small place with good lighting, good drinks, and a stage for forgotten voices. They laughed, often, and when they didn't speak, the silence was full, not awkward, not empty, just comfortable, just right. The waiter brought dessert without them asking. 2 forks, 1 plate. Margaret hesitated, but Daniel just chuckled and passed her a fork. "Teamwork," he said. She shook her head, smiling. By the time they stepped out onto the quiet sidewalk, the city had grown hushed. Street lamps flickered softly, casting halos over the pavement. They didn't rush to leave. They lingered. And when Margaret turned to thank him, Daniel met her eyes and held the gaze not urgently, but with a kind of quiet certainty. "You know," he said, voice lower than usual, "this year's been loud. Even the victories have felt like battles." She nodded. He continued, "Softer now, but somehow, when you're around, everything feels a little less frantic, like I can breathe deeper." He paused. "You're the calm in all my chaos." For a moment, Margaret didn't know how to answer. The words wrapped around her like a shawl, unexpected, warm, a little too much, but not unwelcome. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Instead, she simply smiled. A smile that said, "I heard you." A smile that said, "Me too." He walked her to her car, and they stood beside the door longer than necessary. No hands touched. No promises were made. Just another long look. But this time, it carried weight. It carried possibility. When Margaret got home, she leaned against her apartment door before locking it. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her purse. Not from fear, not from confusion, but from something gentler and far more dangerous. Hope. He once ignored her voice. Now, he wanted it beside him for life. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Sterling's top-floor conference room, casting a soft golden light across the polished table. It had been nearly a year since the day Margaret Hayes first dared to question a multi-million-dollar contract. A year since she was laughed at. A year since Daniel Lockhart saw her for who she truly was. And in that time, everything had changed. Sterling Appliances was thriving not from a lucky quarter, but from a cultural shift built on listening, questioning, and valuing voices that once went unheard. At the heart of it all was Margaret. Not just a title anymore, not just a role, but a presence, a mind, a voice. That Friday afternoon, Daniel sent a calendar invite titled "Only Private Meeting, Conference Room B, 5:30 p.m. Margaret didn't think much of it. They often met to review risk assessments or upcoming board presentations. But when she arrived, something felt different. The room was quiet, empty. Except for Daniel standing by the whiteboard, there were no documents, no folders, no spreadsheets waiting to be discussed. Only one sentence, written in his neat handwriting across the board. "The best choice I ever made was listening to you." Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her fingers still curled around her notebook. Daniel turned, hands tucked into the pockets of his slacks. Not a trace of boardroom formality in his expression. His smile was gentle, steady. "Come in," he said. "This isn't a meeting." She stepped inside slowly, the quiet clicking of her heels echoing louder than usual. Daniel waited until she was close enough to see him clearly, not the CEO, not the man who once dismissed her in front of an entire room, but just him. "When you spoke up about that contract," he began softly, "you didn't just save this company millions of dollars. You saved it from itself." He paused, looking down for a moment, gathering thoughts that clearly mattered. "You changed the way we operate, Margaret. You made people braver. you made me better. And somewhere between the balance sheets and the sleepless nights, I started seeing you not just as the smartest person in the room. He looked back up, but as the person I wanted beside me. For everything. Margaret felt her breath catch, as if her body already understood what her mind hadn't fully allowed itself to hope. Daniel reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a small navy blue box, understated, classic. Her hand instinctively came up to her chest. I thought long and hard about how to do this, he said, stepping closer. You deserve fireworks and orchestras and grand speeches, but that's not who we are. He smiled slightly. We're quiet brilliance. We're hard truths and honest laughter. We're notes passed during budget reviews and coffee that's always just right. So, I thought I'd ask you the only way that ever made sense. Daniel dropped to one knee, not dramatically, not ceremoniously, but gently, as if the moment itself was sacred. He opened the box. Inside sat a simple, elegant ring, a single diamond, set in platinum, with a soft glimmer that didn't shout, but spoke clearly. Margaret Hayes, he said, voice steady but tender. I was wrong the first time I spoke to you. I was blind to your brilliance, and I almost missed the best thing that ever happened to me. He took a breath. I don't want a future where your voice is just something I listen to in meetings. I want it at my dinner table. On lazy Sunday mornings, through hard days and beautiful ones, will you marry me? Margaret's eyes welled with tears, not the sudden, overwhelming kind, but quiet tears that had been building quietly over months of growth, respect, and connection. She knelt down to meet him, cupping his hand in hers. Her voice was soft, a whisper soaked in feeling. Only if we keep listening to each other. Daniel let out a breath that sounded like a laugh full of relief, gratitude, and something deeper. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they stood together, holding on to each other like the world had just shifted beneath their feet and somehow settled more firmly than ever before. There was no applause, no cameras, just silence. The kind of silence that feels like home. They stayed there for a while, arms around each other, heads close, not needing to speak, not rushing to leave. The boardroom, once a place of sharp edges and power plays, now held something much softer a beginning, not of a contract, but of a life. As they walked out of the room, hand in hand, the lights of the city below began to flicker on. Margaret looked at her ring, then up at Daniel, and smiled. The numbers had always told a story. But this was the first one she'd ever get to write from the heart. Together. She once served coffee. Now, her voice served as compass for an entire company. A year ago, when Margaret Hayes entered the Sterling boardroom, her voice had barely been heard, drowned out by louder, prouder men who mistook silence for ignorance. Now, when she walked in, people leaned forward, they listened, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it word by word, decision by decision. It started quietly. The risk reports she authored began shaping company direction. The analysts she mentored started asking better questions. The once broken trust between departments had begun to mend. Margaret had become more than a success story. She was a symbol that no title, no office, no background defined your worth. Only your voice did, and what you chose to do with it. Sterling itself had changed. Gone was the top-down command culture that had nearly cost it everything. In its place was something humbler, something braver. Daniel Lockhart no longer led through intimidation. He led through curiosity, through asking, not assuming, and he made sure others did the same. It was Margaret who had proposed the idea of an internal mentorship group. She called it Second Glance, a space where employees who felt overlooked by their age, their accent, their background could be seen, heard, guided. She held those sessions every other Thursday in the same small conference room where she used to quietly eat her lunch alone, and it filled. Every time. Not just with interns or juniors, but senior managers too curious, reflective, seeking to learn what she had learned the hard way. Some changes were visible. Sterling's annual turnover dropped by 35%. Productivity rose, so did morale. But other changes, the deeper ones, couldn't be measured in numbers. They were found in things like hallway conversations, meeting rooms where assistants were invited to speak, promotion lists that finally reflected the company's true diversity. Daniel had stood by her every step, not in front, not behind, but beside. Together, they had become a kind of compass, one for the other, and for those around them. Their engagement had been quiet. No corporate newsletter, no announcement blast, just a small celebration among close friends and one well-worn leather-bound journal Daniel gave her with a note inside. For the next chapters, the ones we write together. And so came the morning. A big one. Sterling's Strategic Planning Summit. All division heads. All eyes forward. For the first time in company history, the session would be led not by the CEO, but by the head of risk strategy, by Margaret. She stood outside the glass doors, adjusting the lapel of her soft navy blazer. Her fingers brushed the ring on her left hand, still new, still surprising her when it caught the light. But it grounded her, not as proof of love, but as a reminder of how far she'd come from Indiana shop counters to this room full of decision-makers. Inside, conversations buzzed, laptops open, pens ready. Daniel stood at the back of the room, arms crossed loosely, smiling in a way only she could read. Not pride, not awe, something deeper. Gratitude. Margaret stepped through the door, and the room quieted. She walked to the head of the table, the same place Daniel once stood when he'd laughed at her loud, dismissive, and so certain she had nothing to offer. But that moment was no longer her anchor. Now, she carried with her a different weight, the weight of trust. She set her binder down, took a breath, and smiled just a little. "I know we're all here to talk numbers today," she began, "but I want to start with something we rarely quantify." Her eyes swept the room. Perspective. Heads nodded. People leaned in. We talk about strategy, projections, capital. But sometimes the most important thing we can do is pause long enough to ask, who's not at this table? Whose voice haven't we heard? A beat of silence, not awkward, just honest. Because that's how mistakes happen. She continued, softer now, when we assume silence equals agreement, when we confuse credentials with clarity, when we forget that the best answers often come from the places we least expect. Daniel's gaze didn't leave her. Not once. He wasn't thinking about quarterly goals. He was remembering a young woman once dismissed and the empire she rebuilt with her quiet fire. Margaret clicked her pen. "Well," she said with a smile, "let's begin." The room filled with discussion alive, open. And as Margaret led them through charts and risks and hard questions, no one remembered that she used to pour their coffee. They only knew this. She was the woman who had changed the room. Sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones no one notices at first. Margaret's story reminds us that wisdom isn't always loud. It doesn't wear titles or sit at the head of the table. It can live quietly behind a desk, in a soft-spoken thought, or in a quiet act of courage. In a world that often rewards noise and confidence, we must learn to value thoughtfulness, integrity, and quiet conviction. Because real change rarely comes from shouting. It comes from choosing truth, even when no one is listening. For anyone who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or unheard, know this. Your voice matters. And the right people will hear it when you speak from a place of honesty and care. May we all remember, sometimes the greatest strength is found not in power, but in quiet persistence, not in being seen, but in refusing to give up even when we aren't. And, just maybe, that's how the world changes. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of your own journey, or made you feel seen, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. And who knows? The next one might just be yours.